Hey everybody, it's Christian, and today I will show you the new free and open source monitoring tool Checkmk that I recently deployed to my home lab. And guys, this is absolutely fantastic because it can monitor nearly everything that is running on your infrastructure, from physical servers and networking devices to virtualization hosts, the virtual machines themselves, and of course Docker containers. That is really important for me. And the cool thing is that Checkmk automatically scans every host itself to find out what services are actually running on it, and then it monitors them, like the CPU load, the memory, disk utilization, systemd services, but also running VMs and containers. You can even add very specific services to monitor, like the quorum status for the Proxmox clusters can be monitored. And what is pretty cool, it shows you all of this stuff in a nice and rich web interface where you can really drill down into all of the details and get performance statistics, inspect logs, or get alerts. It is really super cool, but it is huge, yeah? Checkmk is a really powerful system that is a beast on its own. So that's why Checkmk reached out to me and asked if I'd like to create an in-depth tutorial for you guys, how to install and set it up, and yeah, here we are. So thanks Checkmk for sponsoring this one, and because we have a lot of stuff to cover today, let's get right into it. Okay guys, so before we start, let us take a quick look at the website of Checkmk, because here you can get more information about their scalable, automated and extensible IT monitoring platform. As I said, it offers many different features. It is also highly automated because you can configure everything using a REST API if you want. And it is really a robust platform that can scale to support hundreds of thousands of hosts. But what I personally love the most about this platform is that it has a free and open source version that is here called the Raw Edition, and this really comes with a huge feature set, including all of the monitoring plugins. Of course, the Enterprise, Cloud and MSP versions, they add a bunch of more stuff to it, like it has auto registration of hosts. This is really helpful if you have a big infrastructure with hundreds of different machines and containers and you want Checkmk to automatically discover them. And it supports a bunch of very specific stuff. It gives you two-factor authentication and so on. But I think it's still cool that they have most of the integrations like LDAP and Active Directory support still in the Raw Edition available, and also integrate with other stuff like Prometheus and Grafana. This is also pretty cool. And yeah, so you can see the Raw Edition already comes with a lot of stuff that is really useful to monitor a small environment or a home lab. Now, if you want to download and use Checkmk on your own infrastructure, you just go to download, and then you can select a platform, install it on a Linux operating system, use Docker or a separate appliance. Now, in this tutorial, we will of course focus on the Raw Edition, the free and open source version, installing this in a Docker container using Docker Compose, which is my preferred choice of deploying anything. But I want to mention at this point here, just because I'm deploying it in a Docker container, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best and the optimal way of deploying it. For a monitoring solution that monitors your entire infrastructure, you usually want to have as few physical dependencies as possible. So it might be a good idea to set it up on a separate appliance that is just there for monitoring everything. But I think in a small home lab environment, it is not a bad idea to do it this way. Here in the documentation or in the download section, they also have some instructions on how you can easily run this with a simple Docker command. But of course, if you're watching my tutorials, you know that I have my own repository for managing deployment templates that is called a boilerplate. So here you will find all of my deployments for Docker Compose. You will find templates for Ansible, Kubernetes, Proxmox, Terraform, and all of that stuff. And here in the Docker Compose directory, I've created a new project for Checkmk with a compose.yaml file that we can use to simply deploy this on one of my testing servers. We will quickly go through this compose file so you know what's happening here and how you can adjust it according to your needs. But let us first of all connect to one of my testing servers here. So I just take the server test1 again. So that's my primary server for doing these tutorials. And let's start with a new directory called Checkmk and cd into that. All right, so here, of course, I want to open this remote connection in VS Code because that's a lot easier. So let's connect to my server and just go into the Checkmk directory. So here I want to create a new compose.yaml file, paste everything from the GitHub repository. And what we're also going to need is, because we have some secrets here, we want to create a new file that is called .env, where I set a CMK password. So this is not always necessary because when you don't set a password, it usually starts generating a random one. But I think in my templates, it is a good idea to set this password by yourself. You can also, by the way, change it later. It doesn't really matter. But if you want to set a password that is predefined, something like test for this test appliance, that's fine. And what we also need is the CMK site variable. So Checkmk is a huge platform that can have several sites, and you want to have separate monitoring instances that do separate things. You don't have to deploy multiple Checkmk containers. You can also just deploy multiple Checkmk sites. So these are managed inside the container. And usually, if you have one small environment like I have, it is enough to just create one CMK site that you just use for everything. Now, keep in mind that the version 2.4.0 latest is still in beta at the time of recording this video. However, I've tested it in my home lab and it's working great. So if you want to go the safe route, just go to the Checkmk documentation and check what is the current latest version. Here you can see it's 2.3.0. So then we have 3 ports that are currently exposed in this template. The first port, 8000, this is needed for the communication between Checkmk and the agent using TLS. The port 5000, this is the web interface port of Checkmk. If you're using a reverse proxy on your server, something like Traffic or Caddy or whatever you like to use, you can remove this port and instead use the reverse proxy to connect to the internal ports 5000 of the Checkmk's container. And the port 162, this is a port that I'm using for SNMP monitoring. This is probably something you don't need. I just barely want to address SNMP in this tutorial because I think that is really a very specific thing. And then we have one volume here that is the persistent volume that stores all the data about the Checkmk sites that you have created here. And because I'm using a traffic reverse proxy, I also connected it to my front-end network, so where my proxy is running. And I've also created some labels that traffic will pick up to expose the port 5000 with a secure HTTPS connection, trusted TLS certificates that are issued by Cloudflare. I bet you have all watched my traffic tutorial video. If not, then there's a good chance now to check it out. I'll link you it in the description. But here I just want to customize a few things here. For example, the host rule here, I want to customize to Checkmk server test1.home.cgrave.de, where traffic is listening for incoming requests and forward it to the port 5000 of the Checkmk container. So therefore, we don't need to expose the port 5000 anymore. We are accessing it through traffic. So port 8000 we still leave open for the agent TLS communication and registration functions. And SNMP, of course, still needs to be open. But apart from that, I think there's everything configured correctly that we need. So we can just go back to the terminal as we have created our template and just hit the docker compose up command. So this now starts a container, creates a persistent volume, and just want to take a quick look at the logs file. So here you can follow it because it's now setting up a bunch of things. As I said, Checkmk is a huge application that requires a bunch of different service applications to run in the background, such as the Nagios monitoring system that it's built upon. And once you start it, you can also see in the logs that here the password is listened. So if you wouldn't have created this password in the compose file, you would see the random password here. And the default administrative user is CMK admin. So now when you see this here, container started, all the services are up and running, you should check if you can connect to the Checkmk instance, and let's see if I can connect to it. So now it's loading, so that's usually a good sign, and here we are. So now let's log in with CMK admin and the password tests, log in, and here we are. So now we have deployed Checkmk. And now one thing before I go through the web interface and show you around and explain how this system works, I first want to also show you one different thing here. Let's exit this log here for now, and let's open a new shell inside the container. So Docker execute an interactive terminal in the container Checkmk, and we will just run bin bash. So inside the container's file system, you can do some administrative tasks on Checkmk, and I think it's important to know these commands. For example, one thing that is important is the omd command. This is the managing interface. So here you can see what sites you have currently running. So if you execute omd sites, you can see that we have created one site And if you want to see what's the current status, you can also check if all the services inside the container are up and running or if there are any problems. So this is important to know. By the way, this is also the place where you can configure the SNMP trap. So when you go to add-ons, here you can enable the MK event D for SNMP traps, syslog, and these kind of things so that you might need. But I don't want to go in too much detail here at this point and exit the container, because I think to get easily up and running, I think it's better to just go through the web interface, show you how this system works, and deploy 1 or 2 hosts so that you can see how to monitoring stuff. All right, so I don't want to do this on my test instance because honestly, it's not so exciting. Here is nothing to see. So let us quickly switch to my production Checkmk instance that I've deployed in my home lab. So here you can see a lot more stuff. So first of all, on the sidebar, this is the general navigation of Checkmk. So here you will find the monitoring settings. So here you can drill into all of the details about your hosts. For example, if I go to all hosts, you can see a list of all the hosts that you have created for monitoring, and you see on the right side a table with all of the services that are currently monitored, how many of the services are up and running, how many of the services have warnings, and if you would have a critical problem, it would marked here as red if there's something wrong, or as pending if there is a check not finished yet and it's currently waiting to get response from the host. So every host in Checkmk has a bunch of different services that are monitored. And services can be anything from, for example, the Checkmk agent that is currently monitored, that reports a summary of the agent version, the operating system it's deployed on, and it also has a service for the CPU load. So this usually reports the Linux CPU load, the CPU utilization with a percentage. It also has Docker containers. As you can see, I'm running 22. And also the memory, you can see here is a warning, so that indicates that the memory is above a specific threshold. It's usually creating a warning when it's more than 100% committed memory. So in my case, I've got 123 memory. Maybe I need to upgrade this virtual machine and give it a bit more memory of my Proxmox host. That would easily solve this problem. And it would create a critical warning if the memory committed is above 150%. And all of these rules are just built in. You don't have to configure them because Checkmk comes with a huge set of predefined services, thresholds, and settings that usually just work out of the box. Of course, you can customize many things here. Like if you go to setup, this is where you create your different hosts, you can add new ones, you can add services, and so on. You can add monitoring rules to these services, discover new things to monitor. Here you have many rules and customization options. You can also go to the users menu here, create administrative users, can create users with other privileges, and so on. But I really would like to keep it simple for this first tutorial because it's really huge. And by the way, what I haven't explained here on the right side, there is an overview bar. So this gives you a quick overview of all of the hosts that are deployed, the services, and how many unhandled warnings or problems you have in your infrastructure. All right, so yeah, if we return to my hosts here in the setup menu, I would love to walk you through the general process of how you set up a new host and how you add different services to monitor them. So for example, I'd love to monitor my server test 1, which is actually just a virtual machine on my secondary Proxmox host. So here it is. And I like to monitor this machine. You can see the memory consumption is also in a critical level probably. Now, with Checkmk, I can finally easily find out and get notified about it. That's a pretty cool thing. So that's one reason why I just wanted to use this application. But first of all, before we can add this as a host in Checkmk, we need to install the Checkmk agent, because Checkmk relies on agents, or it also does some agentless monitoring using SNMP and APIs, but I will show you this later. Usually, if you have a Linux machine or a physical machine or a virtual machine, it is also recommended to install an agent on these operating systems. So when you go in here, go to agents, you can see there is a list of agents for different systems that you can monitor. And we will first of all start with a Linux agent. So this gives you a huge list of different installation packages. And just that you know, the packed agent files are here at first. Like here you can find a .deb file, or you can find an RPM file. Depending on what distro you have, you might want to use the one or another. But you also have some other utilities that you can download here. But usually all you have to do to deploy a new agent here, you just click on that file, download it, upload it to the new Linux VM and install it. So here I will just do it this way. I will copy the link because the agents can download it from Checkmk without authentication, which is pretty cool. So let's go back to the terminal and let's just use wget, and that's it. The agent is relatively small. You can see it here. Once you have downloaded the Debian package, you can easily install it using sudo dpkg-i and then the file. So I currently have installed some version of Checkmk, but I want to just install the new version on it. And then it's creating a systemd service. It automatically starts the agent service on the Linux host. And then we can return back to Checkmk, go to setup, hosts, and create a new host entry for the testing server. So I just want to give it the name server test1. And by the way, if this is a virtual machine that is running on Proxmox, it is a good idea to use the same name as you have defined in Proxmox. So this will have an adventure later on, but yeah, we will talk about that in a few minutes. And then you can also define on which site it is monitored, if it has any parents' permissions and stuff, or an alias. But usually the only thing that you need to do at this point here, if you have deployed the agent, you have to enter the IP address of this server here. So I have an IPv4 only on this machine, and it's just going to return to the shell and currently check which IP address it has. So that should be that one here. And then you can also specify some other monitoring stuff. Usually by default, it will try to check if there is an API integration configured. If not, it will use the Checkmk agent to receive the monitoring information. So that's what we have installed. So, and that is the default value. I think that's great. SNMP you can enable here, but again, we're not going through it in this tutorial. And once you've filled in this information, you can just click on Save and run a service discovery. So at this point, Checkmk starts connecting to the server using the IP address, and it tries to see if there is an agent installed on the host. And because we have installed the Checkmk agent, you can see it automatically discovers. So depending on which services are running on a host, you will see them popping up in the service discovery. And then you can just click on that small plus icon to add them to your monitoring system. For example, we want to monitor the Checkmk agent. We want to monitor the CPU load, the CPU utilization, the disk I/O summary. Honestly, I'm not so interested in it. The Docker containers, I also want to monitor. By the way, I have to show you one thing about that here, but you can also monitor the Docker disk usage. I think the memory, I definitely want to monitor, because here you can already see there's a warning again. As you have seen, I'm running out of memory on this host. And there seems to be one systemd service critical. So one system is in a failed state. You can see it's the open IPMI. That is, for whatever reason, happening on all my VM hosts. I will need to take care of this, but because I remember that I have to do that, I will add it to the monitoring list as well. And yeah, here, just like I told you, you can add more stuff to it depending on what you need. And once you have decided what service you want to monitor and what services you don't want to monitor, you can disable the undecided services. By the way, you can later enable them again if you want, but here you just go to Actions and click on Disable Undecided Services. By the way, just one quick tip I'd like to add at this point here. In this tutorial, I'm mainly adding all of the services that I like to monitor manually in the service discovery view. However, there's also a simpler and faster way to monitor just everything on the host, which probably also makes a lot more sense for you, because if you click on Accept All in the Action tabs menu, it automatically adds all of the newly discovered services to the monitored list without having you to go through the list one by one. And this is not only faster, it also has an advantage because it doesn't cost you anything to monitor all the services on the host, and in that case you won't miss any issues that might occur in the future, even if they just seem okay in this view. But it's basically up to you how and what you want to monitor. Just keeping this in mind as a quick tip, it's better to monitor as much as you can and then only disable the checks that you definitely know are not needed. And what Checkmk also does is it will automatically attach labels to these hosts depending on what type of services are running on it. For example, it adds the device type VM, so you can later query with the host labels what are the different VMs in my monitoring stack and so on. It also attached the Docker object node, because this is a node that is running Docker containers, OS family Linux, because it's a Linux OS, Ubuntu. Now, to accept these automatically discovered labels, you just go to Actions and click on Update Host Labels. And then we have configured a new host. But you might have noticed one thing special at the top right corner. There is a yellow warning sign that says 10 plus changes. And this is something really specific about Checkmk, because anything you change in the monitoring system is not automatically applied to the production config. So if you change anything in the setup or on the monitoring host, these are pending changes, and you first of all have to accept them until they become live on the system. This is also a super useful feature I quickly want to highlight, because especially in large environments where a lot of people are making changes, it allows you to review the entire config and correct any misconfigurations before they go live on the production infrastructure. So that is really useful, and you also see a username and a time zone here in that list to really drill into all of the details and changes. And once you definitely know that you want to activate them, here you can restart the site to activate all of these changes, or you click on that button here above. So let's click on it. Now it's activating it. And because it's a very small environment, it's finished in like 2 seconds or so. It's really, really fast. So then I can go back to monitor, my main dashboard, or better, let's go to monitor all hosts. So then you should see the new entry here, server test 1. Here you can see all the different services that are currently monitored with the status, the performance metrics, statistics, and visualizations. Again, we see the systemd services here is reported as critical, the memory warning. Now, one thing that you might have noticed here is the Checkmk agent also has a warning. And that is because TLS is not activated on the monitoring host. Because by default, if you add a new host that is running a Checkmk agent, Checkmk will reach out to that host and collect information from that agent, but it is not pushing it over a secure connection using TLS. So that's what we definitely have to fix, to submit all of this information in a secure way to the main instance. And the way you do this is you go to the host agent, so where you have deployed the agent, and register the agent with your Checkmk instance. And the way you do this is you just go into the terminal and use CMK agent CTL tool. So if you execute that, you can see here you can register with a new Checkmk site. And you can also do some administrative tasks, reset the registration, renew the certificate, and so forth. So what we have to do here is we have to use the register command, and then we want to set the server to our Checkmk instance. So here I'm just going to copy the server name, not the HTTPS, that's important. And then we want to connect to the site CMK user. I will use my CMK admin user account and set the host name. No, this is the host you want to monitor, server test 1. So now it's getting you the certificate of the Checkmk production instance of the port 8000. So remember, we didn't forward this to the reverse proxy. This is using the self-signed certificate that is generated by the CMK local CA. And now we need to enter the password of the administrative user. Again, on my testing instance, this was test. Now I have to fill in my production instance password. And then the registration should be complete. So now, once that is done, we can return back to Checkmk. And if we refresh, it probably takes some time and that warning should go away. But you can also force a rescheduling event for the monitoring services for each of them. If you click on reschedule Checkmk service, the warning has gone away. All right, perfect. So now we just need to take care of these two things here, what I will later do after recording this video, I promise. So one thing I have to explain, because one thing that is usually not happening by default, and I forgot to fix this before recording this video. You can see here that Checkmk automatically monitors these Docker containers. So this automatically popped up in the service discovery. Usually this is not the case because by default the Checkmk agent does not monitor the Docker engine. However, as I said in the beginning of this tutorial, Checkmk is highly extensible. You can add custom plugins and you can even write your custom scripts and programs that will report monitoring events to Checkmk. And the way you do this is you have to go to the host and add or install plugins that monitor specific services. And usually you just have to download these files that are listed in the menu. You can just go in here to setup and go to Agents Linux. So here in this long list, you can see these scripts, and there is also a section that is called plugins. And here you will find some pretty cool things here. For example, the mkdocker.py. So this will automatically monitor the Docker engine that is running on the host. And the way how you install it is pretty simple. You just click on copy the link, just like with the agent. Go to your host and then go into the user lib checkmk agent /plugins directory. So here we can see I've downloaded the Docker plugin. This is just a regular Python script. You can just take a look at and customize it if you like. One thing that is pretty important for the agent to execute these plugins, you have to add the 755 file permissions so that the Checkmk agent has the privileges to execute the script in this directory. So only then the agent will run these plugins. So once you have done that, place the plugins in the folder with the right privileges, the Checkmk agent will automatically run them. Then these additional services that are discovered by the plugins will pop up in the service discovery. And with these plugins, you can really monitor a bunch of cool things. I will later on show you how to monitor file systems or the Proxmox host and so on. We will go through that in a minute. But I think when we are at this point here monitoring Docker containers, I think I should show you how exactly to monitor actual Docker containers. And this is also pretty easy. You just have to add the Docker containers that are running on your host that you're monitoring in Checkmk as regular hosts. So for each container, you have to add a new host. Here, for example, you can see I'm running traffic production 1. This is a simple Docker container. And with this host, I can monitor the container's memory utilization, the uptime, the container status, and so on. And usually the way you monitor these containers is you take the container ID and add a new host, and then you can monitor it. However, I didn't like the idea of adding the container ID. Instead, I wanted to use the container name. For example, maybe I just want to monitor my GitLab runner here. So why not? I think that's a pretty good idea. And the way how you do this is cd etc checkmk. This is where the configuration files of Checkmk are. Let's go back to setup. Let's go to Linux, and there are example configurations. So here in example configurations, you can see docker.minimal.cfg, but that's not what we want. We want this here, the docker.cfg file. So let's copy the link here, sudo wget, and place it here in the etc checkmk directory. And for this configuration file, we don't need to give it any specific permissions here. But if we take a look at this file, you can see that this has one configuration entry to replace the container ID with the name. Here, for example, it is pretty important that when you're running containers on multiple Docker hosts, all of the container names are unique. So once you have added the configuration file here, you can go back to setup host and just add a new host. Let's go back to my testing server. For example, if I want to monitor, I wanted to monitor the GitLab runner here. So let's copy this name here, place it in here as the host name. So now it is important because a container is not a VM. It doesn't have an agent installed somewhere. Checkmk will gather the monitoring information from the parent host where this container is running and not by connecting to an IP address. So therefore, we click on IP address family and enable no IP. And what we also have to do is we need to disable the IP integrations and the Checkmk agent, because otherwise it tries to connect to a Checkmk agent that is not existing for this container. So let's select no IP integrations, no Checkmk agent, and then click on save and run service discovery. So now, when you've done everything correctly, when the Checkmk agent running on the parent host can successfully gather the information from your Docker engine because you've installed the plugin and you have added the Docker CFG that uses the name instead of the ID, you should see the undecided services of the container are popping up here in the service discovery. And now we can enable the monitoring, for example, of the container status. So when the container is stopped, Checkmk will notice it, generate a warning, and you can generate notifications about anything that's going wrong. You can also monitor the memory consumption of your container, the uptime. I think that's important. The other stuff, I think we don't need. So we will just disable the undecided services, update the host labels, and we're done. No, we're not done. One thing I almost forgot is enable or activate the changes that we have configured. And now when we go to monitoring, you can see there is our new entry for the GitLab runner, and then it just starts monitoring this container. So I know this might seem a bit annoying to go through all of your containers, your Docker hosts, and add all these things manually in the Checkmk UI. So just as a reminder, the paid versions of Checkmk have an auto discovery feature that will definitely help you with the task in your production environment. But if you're using the raw open source edition, there is still a possibility to do that. I won't go through it in this video because otherwise it might be 2 hours long. But just that you know it, there is an Ansible collection for Checkmk to have a programmatic way to add these hosts. That will, of course, also enable you to install the agent, register the agent, add hosts, and so on. By the way, I'm currently working on this in my home lab environment, managing all of this stuff through Ansible instead of doing it in the UI. If you want to see a separate tutorial about that, please let me know in the comments, because then I can go back to Checkmk and say, hey, look, community is happy to learn more about it. So that would be a nice feedback for me. So let me know if you want to see an Ansible video about Checkmk. It would be nice. All right, so now that we have everything, I just want to show you one more thing here, and that is how to monitor Proxmox. I think we can go through this pretty quickly because we have learned everything that is needed, like how to add hosts and stuff. So let's go through it. Let's go to hosts, because currently, as you can see, I have added my Proxmox production 1 here. But of course, I have a secondary Proxmox server, so I want to install that as well. Again, first of all, let's go to Linux, because on Proxmox, it's usually the same process. So you install the agent. So just open a shell to my PRX production 2, download the Checkmk agent, sudo dpkgi checkmk, install it, and it's activated, and it should be up and running. So now let's go back to setup hosts and add a new host for this PRX prod 2. Of course, I need to add the IP address family. I think it's 5, if I can remember correctly. And yeah, everything else is fine. Let's click on Save and Run Service Discovery. So here you can see all of the services that are running on the Proxmox host. So I want to monitor these things: CPU load, utilization. We have seen that already, so I don't need to go through it in detail. On Proxmox, you can see there is a new service here, PVE cluster status. So this is the CoroSync service that I'm using for my high available 2-node Proxmox cluster. It's also pretty nice. Systemd services, there's the IPMI message. Again, I don't know what that is, but I will figure it out. Everything else I can disable for now and update the host labels. Acknowledge the changes here. Then I've added the Proxmox host. Okay, so now there's something pretty cool what you can do in Checkmk, because you cannot just only monitor these services here on the Proxmox host. There's also a Proxmox specific integration that will give you more monitoring statistics about the running virtual machines, because you can see here, we don't see how many VMs are running on this Proxmox host and what status they have if there is a problem. So what we can do here is we need to go back to setup and go to VM, cloud, and container. And in this menu, you have one setting here for Proxmox virtual environment. So when we click on that, we can add a new rule. And here we can just give this a description: Proxmox monitoring. Now, the way you do this is you just enter here your username, your password, the port, and explicitly attach this rule to your Proxmox host. So before we can do that, we need to go to Proxmox and add a monitoring user for Checkmk, because otherwise I don't want to use the root user to log in from Checkmk to Proxmox. So therefore, I think it's a good idea to just go to setup, go to users, and add a new user for Checkmk. So click on add. The username is Checkmk. And I will not use the Linux PAM standard authentication, instead the Proxmox VE authentication server. So that is pretty important. And give this a password that you like. So once we have added the user, we can go to permissions and add a new permission, a user permission, so that this Checkmk user gets privileges on the root path to gather the information from Proxmox. So select the user here. And the role, I think the role we can use the PVE auditor. And this has all the privileges that are enough for Checkmk to gather the information about the virtual machines. Let's click on add. Remember to activate propagate, of course. Once we have created this user, we can go back to Checkmk, add the username, Checkmk add PVE. Fill in the password that we've just created on Proxmox. I think you should also set the port. That is important, I guess. And disable SSL validation if you are using a self-signed certificate for your Proxmox API. And then what you have to do is, usually when you create this rule will be attached to all hosts that you're monitoring in your infrastructure. And of course, we don't want that, because we only have 2 Proxmox hosts here in my infrastructure that I want this rule to apply on. So we go to explicit hosts, select the host name Proxmox Production 1 and Proxmox Production 2 to attach this rule to all your Proxmox hosts. Click on save and of course activate the changes. So now there's one thing that I have to change here, because that check here is using the API. And by default, when you remember, when we go to Proxmox Production 2, there is a default setting that uses the API integrations if configured, and else the Checkmk agent. Of course, here we want to have both monitoring possibilities at the same time, because we have the API that gathers the information about the VMs from Proxmox API, but we also have the Checkmk agent that is reporting the CPU load, the memory, the systemd, and so on. So we have to enable configured API integrations and Checkmk agent at the same time for all of my Proxmox hosts. So redo that for Proxmox Production 1 as well, and of course acknowledge the changes. So now, when we go back to our hosts, because we have attached this rule to Proxmox, we can go back to service discovery. So then you should see, in addition to the monitoring services that we're monitoring and the disabled services, there are 2 new undecided services popping up that come from the Proxmox API monitoring: the Proxmox VE memory usage and the Proxmox VE node information. So this, you can see that it's currently running 1 LXC container and 17 QEMU virtual machines running on this node. And it also reports the subscription and the version information. So of course, I want to monitor these 2 things here. I think that is pretty important. And because the discovered host labels have been changed, these are the active labels, Linux, Debian, but it also is a Proxmox host. That is a new label that Checkmk has attached to the host. We also need to click on update host labels. All right, so now we need to just acknowledge these changes here. Go back to monitoring, and then you should see on the Proxmox Production 2 the new services that are monitored here. So this is how you can monitor your Proxmox host in Checkmk, get information about it, receive information about the host, the virtual machines, and the VMs. Now there's one more thing that I want to show you here, because we just talked about the plugins for the agent when we were talking about monitoring the Docker integrations. Now, on your Proxmox host, you might have running a few other things here. For example, when you go to my Proxmox instance, you can see I'm using an LVM for storage. So the Proxmox is not a Linux disk, it's using an LVM storage. And maybe if you have deployed a ZFS storage on Proxmox, you might want to get information about this as well. And that you can do with the Checkmk agents. That's pretty cool. So let's go in here Let's go once more to the agents, because there are some cool plugins here. For example, one plugin that I am using is the LVM plugin. So this is a really small plugin that just reports back the current disk utilization of the logical volumes and the volume groups. So let's copy this link. And again, just go to my Proxmox server 2, go into the user lib checkmk agent plugins directory and download the LVM plugin. All right. So, of course, we need to give it the right privileges. I still want to do one more plugin here, the smart plugin. So this is pretty cool. I just need to find it where it is. So where is the smart plugin? I think a search function would be really nice in here. Just an idea, Checkmk team. I think I found it here. So here we have the smart plugin that reports the status of the physical disks here. So let's put it in here as well. And what we now have to do, of course, is to change the permissions to 755 to both files in the Checkmk agents. So then the Checkmk agent can execute these two plugins. And when we go back and enable this, let's go back to the host, Proxmox 2, and go to service discovery. And now we have to do a rescan. Now you can see there are some new information popping up here. All right. So we have the logical volume here with a data usage of about 50%. So we want to monitor this. So that one here, the critical warning about the volume group of PVE. So this is reporting the utilization that all the storage is used by logical volumes. So I think I don't need to monitor this. That just shows that all of the physical disk space is used by virtual volumes. So when you compare it to this here, that's the size that is still available on the local LVM. That's what I need. But what is also pretty nice, if we go up here, you can see the smart values for the NVMe. You can see here, okay, that's interesting. The temperature of the internal NVMe drive is above the warning of 35 degrees. So I don't know if that's really a problem. Maybe I would have to add a cooler to this NVMe drive. Would be nice to be notified about it. So let's monitor the statistics and the temperature, as well as the temperature of the SDA and SDB. I think these are the two SSD drives that I also added to this. And yeah, I think that's all I have to monitor for this Proxmox host. So let's disable the undecided services. The host labels haven't changed, so that's fine. We can just acknowledge the changes. And now, if we go back, we have a pretty decent monitoring solution enabled for my entire home lab. So we have enabled the disk utilization of the LVM storage, the smart values of the physical hard drives, systemd services, CPU, memory, even the virtual machines, and the running Proxmox cluster state with the quorum nodes. So I think this is really nice. This gives you a great overview of everything that is running in your home lab. I still want to show you one more thing, and I know we're a bit over time because the video is already too long, but I think this is so important because you might wonder, okay, so I can monitor my host, I can monitor the containers, Proxmox VMs, but what about any custom services like websites, DNS, databases? How do you actually do this? Now, that is important to understand the concept behind it, as every service has to be attached to a host. I'm running a bind DNS server in a Docker container. So I've added a new host for my container that is called DNS-prod1, the same as the container name, to monitor the container status. But I also added an active check to this container to make a DNS query to see if the DNS server is functional. So I not only get notified when there is a problem with the container itself, but also with the DNS service inside the container. And you can enable those checks for any HTTP web service, TCP port you want to monitor, ping request, email and stuff in here in the service rules when you go to HTTP, TCP, and email. So here you can add check host with a ping. You can send a ping request to specific IP addresses. You can add a DNS check service. You can add TCP port connection. You can check web services and also get a certificate check. So you get notified about any certificates that might expire in a few days. You can also add SNTP services, SFTP, LDAP, IMAP mailboxes. So there is so much you can monitor in here. I just want to show you this one example with the DNS service that I have configured. And then it's up to you how you can expand this to your environment. So here I have created a new rule that is called DNS Prod1 DNS monitoring. So here I have set the queried host IP address. So this is a DNS query, like an NS lookup for this name here, for example. That's just a test, right? And my DNS server is the IP address of the DNS server that I want to monitor. And I can also expect a specific answer. So when the IP address of the DNS lookup for the server production 1 is not responding, this IP address, Checkmk will generate an error. So that is the expected DNS answer that I want to get from the server. And now what I am doing is I will run this on this explicit host here, the DNS production 1, and then it's running this DNS request every few seconds, and I get notified about anything that is going wrong on my DNS server. And just like that, you can go and add more rules here, for example, for TCP port connections here. For example, for the TCP port you want to connect, attach this to the relevant host where you want to run this check. And this is how you add custom services to monitor basically anything that you want in your network. Alright guys, so these are just a few quick examples of what you can all do with Checkmk. As I said in the beginning, this software is huge, and as you probably have seen, you can do so many more cool things with it. But in the future, we might explore some other topics, like I already discussed SNMP, which is a big section I might cover in the future. Or what I'm also currently looking at is how to automate the host and service management with Ansible collection, because it's a lot of work to add all these different containers, hosts, and everything manually, especially if you've got such a big home lab like me and you have so many deployments and you're using the raw edition. So therefore, I think the Ansible collection of Checkmk will be really useful. So again, I'm currently working on this. Please let me know in the comments if you'd like to see that. And of course, I want to hear from you guys. What is your opinion about Checkmk? Do you use it in your own home lab or consider using it? And as always, thank you so much for watching, everybody. A huge thanks goes out to all of my members and supporters on Patreon. You guys are really the best and you make all of these videos possible. And of course, yeah, I'm going to catch you in the next tutorial. Take care. Bye-bye.